This is the Ethanol Report, the industry podcast from the Renewable Fuels Association since 2008. I'm Cindy Zimmerman.
The Renewable Fuels Association was at the Farm Progress Show in Boone, Iowa this past week, showing off custom flex fuel vehicles and doing lots of interviews with the nearly 100 reporters in attendance who stopped by the exhibit to visit. Chuck Zimmerman was one of those reporters there who talked with the RFA team, starting with Senior Vice President for Industry Relations and Market Development, Robert White, who's in charge of the custom vehicles that he takes around the country to show what ethanol can do.
Robert, we're here once again with RFA's Flex Fuel electric vehicle, which probably has a lot more miles on it than it did a year ago, I'll bet. But where have you taken this car over the past year, and what have you been able to demonstrate with it?
So it's been another wild year with the vehicle. We started out the year in January at the DC Auto Show, which was 10 days in front of policymakers, agency folks, and, Joe Public. And what was fun was how many people would come up to us, learn about the vehicle, and say, why isn't that an option for us? There's a conversation about going full electric vehicle. There's a conversation that I'll never own one of those, and we all got to meet in the middle somewhere. Someday we will. And this provides that landing spot for the EV-only crowd when, things don't develop at the speed they want. And for us on the other side, whether it's a range extender or, just for putting around town, the EV side, on a plug-in hybrid makes a lot of sense. But it can be packed with 11 gallons in this case, in this vehicle, with liquid fuel, low-carbon E85, and we can go over 450 miles. So I think the writing's on the wall, and we started to see that through some of the automaker announcements that they're leaning more towards the plug-ins as a middle ground.
What kind of feedback do you get from people when you display these kinds of vehicles?
Well, here's a good example where we got a hot rod off-road vehicle to set the hook or get the lure out, and then we talk about the EV that's powered by ethanol. And really, it's kind of the best of both worlds. And obviously, we're at an agricultural event, and a lot of farmers that don't see these vehicles in their neighborhoods or in their counties. And so you start that conversation and try and explain that, yes, they're reading headlines that say we're going EV only in 7 years, which is partially accurate with current regulation, but that we're fighting on their behalf to make sure not only we're using more ethanol, growing demand here and abroad, but at the same time we're making sure that we can grind more corn in a market where it's very important.
Well, one of our presidential candidates has made his opposition to EVs very clear, and Donald Trump seems to be working with Elon Musk in his campaign. Anything you think you could do to draw their attention to what this type of vehicle could do and get their support?
Well, I think eventually, Mr. Musk and former President Trump are just examples of that'll never happen, but ironically from two different sides. I think Elon is one of those examples where we will see them looking for a soft landing spot or continuing to diversify what Tesla is involved in, whether that's space travel or I saw something maritime the other day. These businesses are going to have to do something different. Only EVs will not survive the shareholder meetings. And on, former President Trump, he always was supportive vocally of ethanol. He did approve E15 at one point, but we had a lot of small refinery exemptions too. So both of those gentlemen need to have continued education, and as they're on the campaign trail, we encourage farmers and anyone listening, our members, of course, to make that connection and help educate them even more about how important ethanol is to rural America and to the everyday consumer nationwide.
Well, USDA just awarded another round of grants to increase the availability of higher blends. Tell us about that and how RFA helps retailers interested in getting those grants.
Yeah, since the dawn of BIP and then turned into HBIP, the last few rounds actually came out of the Inflation Reduction Act. And that was $500 million in total that had to be matched, and some of that was matched by corn grower money, retailer and self-investment. But we've seen stations that have been awarded grants from California to Florida and all parts in between. And we've been providing free grant writing services as part of our daily routine at the RFA. And after all these years, we still have a 100% success rate. So we're very proud of our ability to help those retailers navigate the governmental labyrinth of grant writing and grant awardee and what happens even after that. But it's very important that this infrastructure gets in the ground. I mean, there are a couple states where E15 is required in the future, but in the meantime, again, with today's markets, we want to grind more corn and sell more ethanol.
How much has the availability of E15 grown this year, and what are the chances California will ever approve the sale of E15 as the only state that does not allow it now?
Well, let's start with the first part of that question. It's a little happier note. I think we're seeing anywhere from 2 to 3 new E15 stations a day, probably 1 E85 station a day. And E15 is evolving. In the early days it was, it's a mid-grade, it's unleaded 88. We had all these great marketing ideas. But at the end of the day, it started out just like E10. When E10 debuted, it was a mid-grade, it was 89 octane. And as time went on, the refiners started figuring things out, marketing groups started figuring things out, and suddenly E10 was the base fuel. That's what we're starting to see across the Midwest and as far, as Arizona to New York, where, we can replace E10 with E15 as long as we still offer an E10 somewhere else. So we're seeing E10 replacement at hundreds of stations across the country, and that's really where you start building demand when nearly every consumer filling up at a fueling station is using E15. On the flip side, in California, it's amazing we're still working on this, but we're also working on year-round E15 at the national level. California is the last holdout, the last state where you can't sell E15. And ironically, given their low-carbon fuel standard and our low-carbon fuel that it makes E15, we could sell it for anywhere from 20 to 25 cents a gallon less today in a state where fuel prices are well over $5 a gallon. We recently had some discussions with the California Air Resources Board that has to approve E15, and unfortunately we couldn't come to an agreement on many things, and so it will at least be another handful of years before E15 is approved because we haven't even started the rulemaking process.
RFA President and CEO Jeff Cooper had the opportunity to talk about a number of timely topics, including rail transportation, 45Z tax credit guidance, production, and record export demand.
Well, we're at the Farm Progress Show. Why is it important for RFA to have a presence here?
Well, this is one of my favorite events of the year because it really gives us a chance to hear directly from rank-and-file farmers about what the things that they're thinking about and the concerns that they have and the fears that they have and the ideas that they have. And it's just a really a great way for us to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in agriculture. Farmers built the ethanol industry, again, as a way to add value to their crops and build demand, local demand, for the products that they were producing. So, we are inextricably linked with our friends in agriculture, and this is a great way to make sure that we are continuing to build and expand that relationship.
RFA was represented at both the RNC and the DNC conventions. So what are you going to do to discuss ethanol industry issues with the candidates now?
Well, that's correct, Chuck. We did just recently return from both the Republican National Convention and the DNC last week in Chicago, and we are a nonpartisan organization. We don't advocate for any particular political party, but we do advocate for ethanol, and we advocate and promote policies and regulations that are supportive of growth in the industry. And both of those events are really good opportunities for us to sit down with representatives of both those campaigns and make sure we're answering their questions about ethanol and renewable fuels, and that we're interacting with those campaigns and making sure they have the most accurate and factual information. It's also an opportunity for us to reconnect with lots of other important and influential politicians who attend those events, and we made great contacts and had great conversations at both.
Well, let's turn to another thing. The industry had a little scare last week with the threatened shutdown of rail operations. This came at the same time that RFA had submitted comments to the Surface Transportation Board about growth in the freight rail industry. Tell us why the rail operations are so important to the ethanol industry and what RFA suggested to the STB.
Yeah, it was a dicey situation over the past week around the potential for a rail strike and closure for CN and some of the other railroads that run into Canada. Obviously, that would have been a huge concern and problem for us because Canada is our number one export market. Most of the product that goes north of the border gets there on rail. So it would have been a major disruption if those lines had shut down because of a labor dispute. Fortunately, that didn't happen. They were able to come to an agreement and keep those rail lines running and keep the trains on the tracks and keep them moving. But I really do think it underscores the importance of rail transportation and having efficient, reliable rail transportation to the ethanol industry. It was just kind of coincidental that we at the same time had responded to an invitation for comment from the Surface Transportation Board asking about what could be improved, what things should they be looking at to make sure that the rail industry continues to serve the needs of the industry. Almost 80% of the ethanol we produce in the United States moves by rail. So, nearly 4 out of every 5 gallons is at some point on the rails, and that just, again, really underscores and highlights the importance of having a reliable, safe, and effective and efficient rail system, and that's why it's a high priority for us.
Well, the carbon capture pipeline project and guidance for the 45Z tax credit are critical for corn ethanol to be part of the future for sustainable aviation fuel. What do you think about the current status of both and whether they'll make the necessary progress that's needed?
Well, that's one of the big questions we're getting at events like this, where you get lots of farmers coming in and saying, hey, so is corn ethanol going to be part of the sustainable aviation fuel opportunity or not? They're hearing lots of conflicting things and different viewpoints and things out there. And unfortunately, our answer right now is we're not sure yet because we're still waiting on guidance and rules from the Treasury Department on how that 45Z tax credit is going to work. And exactly what this opportunity might look like for corn ethanol as a feedstock for SAF. We're hopeful that we're going to see a proposal from the Treasury in the next month or so, and we're hopeful that it avoids some of the problems with the precursor tax credit, which was called the 40B Sustainable Aviation Fuel Tax Credit. There are lots of things that we did not like about the way Treasury rolled that out. They were very prescriptive on what sort of ag practices can be used to lower carbon intensity, and it had several other problems. So we're hopeful that Treasury heard our feedback on that, again, that kind of precursor tax credit, and they correct a lot of those flaws when they put the proposal out for 45Z. The other thing we're keeping an eye on is that credit, according to the law, is supposed to be available. It's supposed to be effective on January 1st of 2025. That's a few months away. And we still don't have rules yet around how it's going to operate. We don't have much more clarity on how the carbon intensity values are going to be calculated. So there's a lot of work for Treasury to do in a very short time. And, of course, we've got an election in the middle of all that, and that could certainly influence and shape the timeline for when these rules come out. So that's at the top of our list as we look at things that need to get done between now and the end of the year.
Well, taking a look at the current supply-demand situation for ethanol, seems like production and exports are both up, and while the corn crop is forecast to be slightly lower this year, yields are record high. How do you see the situation right now for ethanol producers?
Well, it's been a great year for the ethanol industry. We are on pace to be at record production or very near record production, somewhere around 16 billion gallons, we think, by the time the year is over with. And part of what's driving that is very strong demand, both domestically but especially in the export market. We're on track to have a record year for ethanol exports, somewhere between 1.8 and 2 billion gallons, we think, will be exported. That would be the highest share and the largest volume that we've ever exported, which is great to see. I mean, it's really helped support the supply-demand picture and profitability for the industry this year. The industry's in great shape from a profitability standpoint, from a feedstock availability standpoint. We are going to have a large corn crop this fall. And, for the farmers we're talking to here who are very concerned about corn prices, we remind them that, hey, we'll take whatever you can send us. We're going to grind 5.5 billion bushels of corn into ethanol this year, and we want to do more than that. So that's where we need to be partners with our farmer friends in expanding the market for ethanol through E15 and longer term through sustainable aviation fuel.
With the increase in ethanol exports this year, what's your outlook for the upcoming export exchange that'll take place in Fort Worth in October?
Yeah, so, along with growth in exports for ethanol, we're also seeing very strong export demand for distillers' grains and other co-products that come from ethanol facilities. That's really going to be the focus of the export exchange event. It's really focused around feed grain exports and also co-products from the processing industry. And that's, again, about 1 out of every 3 tons of distillers' grains we're producing is exported. Hugely important to the industry, and we need to continue growing demand internationally for distillers' grains. The export exchange has always been, I think this is our 8th or 10th export exchange. It's always been a great opportunity to really grow awareness and visibility on the value of those co-products and get new customers and actually, business deals get done at this event. So we're looking forward to another successful export exchange coming up in October.
So it was another great year for RFA at the Farm Progress Show. Hope you enjoyed it. If you need any more information about ethanol, just go to the RFA website, ethanolrfa.org. And that's the Ethanol Report. Thanks for listening.